like anybody, I have, I'd say, a healthy fear of death or decrepitude. I mean, I don't want to feel unwell. And if life is great, then why would you not want it, right? If you like your loved ones, why would you want them to disappear from your life or be absent? I mean, that's just common sense. If everybody were getting bacterial infections at 30 and dying, would the right thing be to focus on solving aging? Probably not, because nobody's going to even make it to aging. They're going to die way before from some other thing. And it's only in the 20th century that we solved enough of these other problems that aging has become the dominant problem. There's such a indoctrination that aging is inevitable. So if your starting point is to believe that aging is inevitable, then you basically look at the budget and you would say, you know, like in Germany, right? It's probably something like 30% of the budget that goes to pay for aging. And how does it happen? Well, pensions, the healthcare, and other associated costs, right? And by the way, that's going to go up every year because the aging population is going up and there are less people to work to support that aging population, right? So it's just so ironic that people ignore this gaping hole in the budget, which is an absolute result of aging and is only going to get worse. And they just ignore it because of this literal magical thinking that aging is inevitable. So how can we sit around and just pretend? And this is like, literally, it's like being a toddler, just closing your eyes and just going, la, la, la,
I
la,
don't
la,
see
this
anything.
doesn't exist. I don't see anything. This doesn't exist. We went from 4% to 25% to 30% in some countries. And you think that the economic system can sustain this? It's just ridiculous. Humans win, not because we're the strongest or the fastest or even the smartest necessarily, even though maybe we are the smartest, but actually we're the most coordinated. And we're the most coordinated because we can have common fictions and we organize around these common fictions. And that's why we win. What we're trying to do with Vitalist Foundation, we are aiming for a number, 1% of GDP globally, to go to solve aging through science and technology. So that's a very concrete number. Our bet is that we could see some real acceleration, especially and maybe most importantly, because deep down, everybody wants to be healthier for longer. This is not, you know, something foreign that we're trying to put upon people.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for being here.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Great to be here.
I want to start with an enormously big question, which is especially important with all the latest development of technology. And I know that you've been fascinated by this question for a very long time. So I'm curious to hear your opinion. What does it mean for you to be a human?
Thank you. This is a question I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Before I give an answer, I'd like to slightly rephrase it. So we have two lenses, at least, that we look at this question, because what it means to be human could also be the inverse. What does it mean to not be human? So in other words, what is the separator where beyond which we move to a different class of being? And we're on track to face these kinds of questions as we start guiding our own evolution in the coming decades and centuries. So, you know, and by the same token, you could ask, well, what differentiates humans from apes or other animals or other things we're aware of? And I find that those lenses to be also useful to think about this question. Fundamentally, if you think about when a human changes to become something other than a human, there's this really great YouTube video called Who Am I? By a channel called Pursuit of Wonder. And it tries to identify what is that thing that is the I. Now, Buddhism has its own perspective about the I not existing as a permanent thing. And in this YouTube video, they also walk through a cyborgization process over time, kind of projecting into the future and imagining how we might replace all of our body parts and progressively our brain with different types of technology, and constantly asking, well, At what point are you no longer you? At what point are you no longer human, etc.? And I think it boils down to 5 things that I think make us special that need to come in combination, probably, which represent an important part of our humanity. One is agency, the sense that you have choice, even if that choice is not actually grounded in the physical reality of the world. So, Albert Einstein said, God doesn't roll the dice. Does that mean that everything is deterministic? Does that imply that our idea of choice and agency is merely an illusion? I don't know, but I think part of being human is having that illusion, basically inhabiting that state where you have perceived agency combined. So that would be the first, combined with self-awareness. That would be the second. The third would be mimicry. And I specifically say mimicry because we're social creatures, and mimicry implies that we're somehow engaging in our environment and copying, right? Then I would say emotions. So that's 4. I'm sorry. So those are the 4. It's not 5. So it's 4: self-awareness, agency, emotions, and mimicry. I think those are some of the key of what it boils down to. With that being said, my sense is that we're going to probably change as organisms in the next 100 years in ways that are going to challenge these ideas and create more nuanced boundaries between states and in what each of these categories is defined as. Right? What is agency? What are emotions? At what point do emotions cease being what we would call the human template or are something else, right? I mean, of course, we manipulate our emotions even now. Somebody may be depressed and take an SSRI. Does that make them inhuman now that they've basically taken out the sad? No, we celebrate that, right? We say that person was too sad. And so maybe it's fine for them to be quote unquote too happy. So there's some sort of range. And I'm sure you could probably, if we understood our biology better, we could probably parameterize it and kind of identify what the range is of human experience. And if we had that knowledge, so I think that knowledge does exist, except we just don't know how to measure it, then we could parameterize and say, you are within the sphere of human, because that's basically the range. And I'll just say one final thing here, because it really evoked this thought in me that differentiates my perspective from that of Bryan Johnson. Around 2016, I was trying to self-optimize, and I had this system where I would do all these things, basically outsourcing my life to a pattern. I would meditate for X minutes, I would log things, I would work out in certain ways, et cetera, et cetera. And at a certain point, I reached this existential crisis where I just asked myself, well, if I take this to its logical conclusion, what would be the point? I would just be a machine just following a routine. And that would rob me of the sense of agency, choice, wonder, exploration, surprise, etc. And I just wasn't willing to make that trade-off. So I actually drew back from a lot of these things that I was doing and started doing them in, let's say, more moderation. Now, in a sense, you could say, well, if something is making you feel good, you want to do it. If meditating makes you feel good and perform better, if exercise does that for you, if better nutrition, you should do all those things. And I do all those things. But I also am very hesitant and conservative about giving away choice and agency and the variance of succeeding and failing at doing different things in life, because I do think that's a core part of being human. And so when I faced the question, would you outsource your life to an algorithm? My answer was no, I wouldn't do that.
Oof. I have so many questions now. Super cool. Thank you very much. Many insights. My first one is, how about outliers? I mean, we glorify outliers, the people of great intelligence or great passion or great leadership. They would definitely fall somewhere out of the scope of average human range. So they would be superhuman, probably.
Right. I mean, being outside average would still fall within the definition of human, because I guess that's kind of this biological template that we're accustomed to. I mean, you could also argue that certain mutations in the genome might make somebody different, distinctly different, and no longer human. I think that people range dramatically in their experience of the world and their ability to engage with the world and their understanding of the world. But I mean, it's interesting, right? But what does that imply about the value of that or the extent of their humanity, right? So in society, we celebrate people being intelligent. And that doesn't mean that we denigrate people who are less intelligent, but we do celebrate the ability to impact your surroundings and secure more abundance and a better life and problem solve as fundamentally human. Nobody says being, less intelligent is desirable or glorious. And so as a species, we have this gravity to expand our intelligence. And in a way, you could say that because change is inevitable, even just on a biological basis, right? There's some sort of selection pressure for certain traits in any population. Just if you think about genetic selection. And over time, whether it's the color of our skin or the manner that our intelligence is structured, we have these different gravities. So if you assume that it's inevitable that humans are going to change, it's just about the scope and the velocity. And then really where I come down is that all you can do is think, okay, what are some things that are unique and worth treasuring? And how do we retain those while giving the rest of the stuff kind of flexibility to unfold? So if what you're talking about around outliers, and let's say we want more of these outliers, or how do we engage with these outliers, lands in a certain place, we can pursue that. It's fine as long as we don't undercut what I would consider the basics. That's at least my mental model.
Yeah, fair enough. I love what you said about Bryan Johnson. It seems like to a certain point you followed same route, but then you just moved in different directions, and it was very, I would say, warm for me to discover that vitalism is actually much more human. And tell me, how did you get interested in longevity, and what is your personal story behind creating this movement?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'll just start by saying, I really appreciate you mentioning that vitalism struck you as a more human perspective. That's what we believe as well. And I would just add two small notes on that, on how I think that Bryan Johnson's direction and the vitalist direction are nuanced and slightly diverge. One is about the sense of agency in general. So on the one hand, Bryan says, well, wouldn't you outsource your life to an algorithm if it would make you feel happy all the time, right? And to me, that sounds like, would you hook yourself up to an opium pump? It would feel happy all the time, right? And I would reject that. I don't think that's a good outcome. But on the other hand, which is just the other side of the same coin, the don't die perspective that I've heard often is this idea that AI will save us. And that also is a message of absent agency. So suggesting that, the majority of humans can sit back and wait for AI to come and save us. Whereas the vitalist perspective is a perspective that calls for agency. It basically says, we need to be the source of our own salvation. We need to wake up and start allocating resources to the core problems that plague us. And without our initiative, we're likely going to fail. So that's a very strong distinction on the side of agency and choice. And yeah, so let's see. So how did I get into longevity? I mean, my motivating factor was around understanding the universe and understanding what the nature of existence is. So like anybody, I have, I'd say, a healthy fear of death or decrepitude. I mean, I don't want to feel unwell. And if life is great, then why would you not want it, right? If you like your loved ones, why would you want them to disappear from your life or be absent? I mean, that's just common sense. And I think deep down, everybody is a vitalist in that sense. But for me, the trigger, I was exploring what it meant to have consciousness, and I was doing a lot of meditating, and I studied neuroscience in college. And then I came across the Aubrey de Grey talk about ending aging. And I just thought, okay, well, this makes a lot of sense. And I was just considering stopping everything and working on it. But I just felt like I didn't have the levers that would make a difference. And so like many people, I just took a step back and I built up my career as an entrepreneur. But, the motivation from the start was just what I would call first principles response to something which is very straightforwardly bad, and treating it with the tools of human effort and ingenuity. So in other words, to me, if I look at a problem, my bias is always to say, okay, let's use human effort to solve that problem and not just accept it as it is.
That's interesting. I wonder, now I cannot stop thinking about what you said about you and Bryan Johnson. I wonder, large part of longevity movement consists of tech people. And I understand that this idea of quantified self and let's disassemble a human because human is a machine. Now we will understand how it works. We will crack the code and that's it. And you said that you don't want to give away the agency because it's a kind of, you are losing the control over your own life and believing that an algorithm can decide better for you.
Yes.
And he is trying to develop the best algorithm and spread it around as much as possible. So more people are engaged.
Yes.
That's interesting. Like both actually are different sides of control, but I would say they are very distinguished.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the difference may seem nuanced at the starting point, but if you take it over time, it will diverge dramatically. Ultimately, there's nothing wrong with finding better algorithms to improve people's well-being and to create more abundance and richness in the world and explore the world and new knowledge. But that being said, if your perspective on it is one of aversion to agency, you will be much more likely to give up agency over time. Now, in Bryan's case, this is his clearly expressed storytelling, a lot of this came from personal challenges that were pretty dark in terms of not being happy or carrying out self-destructive behaviors. And so an algorithm is almost like a tool in this case to pull out of that and to bring oneself into a better place. And, that makes total sense, right? If you think about the evolution of that philosophy and you look at agency as something which is self-destructive, then you would say, okay, we want to minimize agency. But if you think about agency as something which is constructive, your attitude is going to be completely opposite. You would say, let's use our agency to find better algorithms and then have even better agency and keep finding better algorithms that will further improve our agency. You know what I mean? So, it lands in a very different place. And my concern is that any place where humans are encouraged to or pressured to or gravitate to giving up agency can end up pretty dystopian.
Obviously. But from the other side, we are already living in not a perfect world. And in your interviews, you mention how ineffective is the current resource allocation. And all our healthcare system now focuses on treating late stage illnesses instead of preventing them from happening. So this is Sickcare versus healthcare. And the analogy is brilliant. But why do you think such a deeply flawed system was created in the first place?
Yeah, the Sickcare system seems like a natural evolution that comes in tandem with technological progress and organizational progress. So generally speaking, humans have a very strong immediacy bias and acuteness bias, and they have a very low ability to project themselves into the future and make decisions about their future selves. These are just known facts from research into human psychology. So if you think about it, right, like how did things emerge in medicine? Typically, your average person, in the Middle Ages or in antiquity, they wouldn't, if they weren't feeling bad, like why would they do anything? They wouldn't go to a doctor, they wouldn't seek assistance. So this whole notion of like improving health was very, let's say, underexplored. And so you have this acceleration in medicine, which is driven by acute cases. And this is just the full kind of history of medicine. And so now also you have people dying at earlier ages. So, you're 30, you suddenly get tuberculosis, you're dead, or tetanus, or whatever it is, right? And so in the earlier days, you had so many causes of death that were acute, sudden, and very serious, that it made sense that tons of capital and attention went in those directions. So in that sense, I almost would say that our success has been the recipe for this problematic structure. So to put another way, if everybody were getting bacterial infections at 30 and dying, would the right thing be to focus on solving aging? Probably not, because nobody's going to even make it to aging. They're going to die way before from some other thing. And it's only in the 20th century that we solved enough of these other problems that aging has become the dominant problem. So even though it's true that the Sickcare system has now become this punching bag for everything from obesity to anything else, it's really, for a long time, it was the most rational, best thing that humanity could do. Just treat these acute cases, make them go away so that people could make it longer in life. And so, the system, because it's built around being reactive, has ended up in this place, which now has become inflated into a massive perversion, which it was never intended to be. And that perversion is to look at the quote unquote diseases of aging and just think about them with the same old hammer of this is just like, an infectious disease. So let me use the same hammer for that. It's not going to work, because these so-called diseases of aging are nothing but aging itself. Their incidence goes up 1,000-fold with aging. It doesn't really matter if you call them a part of aging or not. They're a result of people being aged, basically. That it's not just correlation, it's basically causation. And so if you look at that and you realize, like, okay, the evidence is clear. You fix one of these quote unquote diseases, you only buy 2 years or 3 years, often in poor health. And even the people who use these terms, which are an oxymoron, healthy aging, it's actually, I find it very hypocritical and unfortunate, because when they say healthy aging, what they mean is you still are going to lose 50% of your function. You're just not ridden with cancer or heart disease or dementia. That's I would say, the tyranny of low expectations or low aspirations for what humanity could achieve or could be. And it's also, unfortunately, a kind of a very pessimistic or low belief in the transformative power of human ingenuity, science, and technology, which is just so sad. Look at what humanity has achieved. Why can't we be optimistic and think about an abundant future where we do solve these problems and actually try to solve them, because we can. And so that's kind of the evolution of it. And now we're stuck with a system that's not fit for the problems. And we have what I would call distractors that, in the form of the chronic disease epidemic and other diseases of quote unquote modern life. So if you look at, for example, the US, and you probably have heard about some of this stuff with Robert F. Kennedy running, for president, and now Make America Healthy Again alongside Trump. And these folks, Kelly and Casey Means, who talk about the chronic disease epidemic. And of course, they make a good point, right? That they say, well, look at all these people. We're poisoning them with our ultra-processed food system, which is also, you could say, a kind of warped outcome, which is married to the positive outcome of modernity, right? We're so clever. We can industrialize food production. We can make all this stuff. We can make so much of it, and we can make it so delicious that people become addicted to it. It has all these negative consequences. They eat too much of it, etc. And then, of course, the pharma system is happy to step in and say, oh, let's treat it just like an acute disease. So now we'll treat obesity as a disease. We'll call it a disease, and we'll, shoot people up with Ozempic and make Denmark, like the biggest winner, because it has Novo Nordisk that developed Ozempic. And so it's unfortunately a misunderstanding to think about that as the primary sick care problem, because really what that is not about sick care. It's about an unnecessary fault where we're harming. It's like self-harm. Why are we giving these people poison just to try to cure them of the poison with some drug, which actually causes all these other side effects? This is just, unfortunately, of course, that's ridiculous. And there is an element of truth there. It is a type of sick care, but the majority of costs are still in people over 65, the vast majority of costs. So even when people like Kelly and Casey Means talk about the chronic disease epidemic, actually the vast majority of costs are still in people over 65. Because the fact is, if you are obese and you are in your 30s, guess what? Your body has enough buffer to somehow keep you around and functioning and not be in an acute situation. But when you're 50, 60, 70 and you're obese, well, guess what? You're on the way to heart attack central, you have diabetes, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And so these things are also not divorced. I mean, I think they both need to be addressed, of course, but we're all affected by aging. And so that does need a lot of attention.
I would say it needs a lot of attention because by the year 2050, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of people, I think 1 out of 4 will be over 65, especially the developed countries. Yeah, we see that already with Japan. And it happens everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. It's incredible to me that people talk about because there's such a indoctrination that aging is inevitable. And because humans defer generally to status and authority when they evaluate things. And it makes sense, right? By the way, we're not in a specialized world, which is basically the world of modernity. Not everybody can be like a nephrologist or a radiation expert or an astronaut. You know what I mean? Like we have to defer to people who are experts at different things. Otherwise, we'd be nowhere. But unfortunately, that also has the negative outcome that when there are certain things that are, let's say, fixed within the Overton window and people accept them as dogma, and those things are very harmful, that it's very hard to dissociate and pull away from them. And one of those things is this idea that aging is inevitable. So if your starting point is to believe that aging is inevitable, then you basically look at the budget and you would say, like in Germany, right? It's probably something like 30% of the budget that goes to pay for aging. And how does it happen? Well, pensions, the healthcare, and other associated costs, right? Now, the average German isn't thinking, I pay 48% income tax, and actually 16% of that 48% is just paying for the aged population. And by the way, that's going to go up every year because the aging population is going up and there are less people to work to support that aging population, right? So it's just so ironic that people ignore this gaping hole in the budget, which is an absolute result of aging and is only going to get worse. And they just ignore it because of this literal magical thinking that aging is inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. We may as well just pay the price, whatever the price is, even though the price is literally leading us to insolvency. And just as a final note on that, the U.S. deficit is $1.6 trillion a year. Okay, so the U.S. makes about $5 trillion from, it's more or less, from all of its tax receipts and other income sources, right, the government. And it spends about $6.6 trillion, right? But of the $6.6 billion that the U.S. government spends, about 2.5 trillion, so 6.6 trillion, 2.5 trillion of that pays for aging in the form of Medicare, 1 trillion, Social Security, similar, and then about 30% of Medicaid, which is another program for those who are poor. And so it's free healthcare. And of those people, of course, the ones who consume the most per capita are those over 65. So I just find it so absurd and ironic and unfortunate that we live in this mass illusion where people say the deficit is a problem, but they pretend aging is not a problem, even though we spend much more on aging than the entire deficit.
Say that it's even more ironic because all our systems in the developed countries are structured in a way that tell you, okay, first you are young, then you study, then you start to work. You pay high taxes to provide for people who are older. And then at some magnificent moment, you will also become old and somebody probably, hopefully, will pay for you.
Right.
That's, I think, a bit hypocritical.
Absolutely. And, it's funny because this was never the case, right? Pension systems didn't exist in the past. I mean, in the 18th, 19th century, these ideas were just completely foreign because nobody made it that late in life. And that's the thing that you just can't ignore. The percentage of 65 plus year olds in most developed economies 120 years ago was about 4%, 3%, 2%. So you basically went from a situation where meeting an old person was like a rare event. First of all, they were not like in their 80s. They were, 70. And even a person who's 70, it would be like 1 in 20, 1 in 25 people. You know what I mean? So, it was kind of rare. They probably weren't out and about that much. It was, sometimes you meet somebody like that. rarely. Now it's like in Japan, it's almost 1 in 3 people, literally almost every person. So how can we sit around and just pretend? And this is like, literally, it's being a toddler, just closing your eyes and just going, la, la,
I
la,
don't see
la, this doesn't
anything.
exist. I don't see anything. This doesn't exist. We went from 4% to 25% to 30% in some countries. And you think that the economic system can sustain this? It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, we definitely need a movement, which is vitalism. And I think that you put a lot of thinking into what is needed to create a movement. Can you share some of your insights?
Yeah, I mean, we're far from solving it, is what it feels like. Otherwise, we would have made more progress, but we made some progress. Fundamentally, the big question I asked myself when starting was, I mean, what do we need to do in the first place to accelerate? So like, why would it need to be a movement and not like just start another company or something like that, right? And what I concluded was that the vicious cycle that we're in is just so ingrained that any single point of intervention is very unlikely to move the needle. And ultimately, if you think about general change in society typically has a philosophical undercurrent. So there are these different perspectives. Does the philosophy precede some change, or is it like some change with then births the philosophy, right? People started working in factories, and then Marx and Hegel came up with this idea of, like the means of production are an important thing, and whoever controls those means of production should have political power, right? And by the same token, this happened in different economic changes in history. And so even though we don't know what the order is, it is pretty clear that for big change to happen, there has to be a philosophical undercurrent. You can't, it almost never happens without it. And I think that's largely because we change based on coordination. This is something that Noah Harari talks about in Sapiens, right? That humans win not because we're the strongest or the fastest or even the smartest necessarily, even though maybe we are the smartest, but actually we're the most coordinated. And we're the most coordinated because we can have common fictions and we organize around these common fictions. And that's why we win. And so I believe in that. And so my thought was, well, if we just start one company, I mean, this inertia of the system, and what I mean by the system is, regulatory systems that were built around Sickcare, lawmakers that are pressured to support Sickcare because it's affecting people in the here and now, research granting bodies that are all completely subsumed by Sickcare, an industry, a pharma industry, which is all built around Sickcare because of these regulatory means, et cetera, et cetera. It just felt like you're not going to be able to move this juggernaut without some sort of movement. And so what does it take to create a successful movement? Just going back to the key question you asked, there are two things that a lot flows out of. One is a clear vision. So what is it that we're going towards? Because if our problem that the movement is trying to solve is coordination, we have to be able to communicate in a way that's sufficiently effective for people to be able to communicate, to coordinate, to say, hey, I believe in X, that makes me and you partners in a way, if you believe in X too. And so then we can more effectively use our different energies and skills and gifts to make progress. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is a concrete set of immediate next steps. Because if you just articulate a big vision, but people don't know exactly what they should do right now, well, you're going nowhere fast. And so what we're trying to do with Vitalist Foundation, because, vitalism is a philosophy. Anybody can be a vitalist, but we have a foundation that we started, a nonprofit, to accelerate the ideas of vitalism, is basically to say, okay, we are aiming for a number, 1% of GDP globally, to go to solve aging through science and technology. So that's a very concrete number. Although there's a big question where, and this is also rather unsolved, what qualifies to be counted in that number? So how do we, let's say that's $1 trillion.
You can
right?
say that, I don't know, like trying to cure the chronic illnesses also counts as curing aging.
Right. And also you could say that tools are a key part of curing aging, and therefore they should also count. Like, for example, if you imagine a project like the Apollo project, Well, you had a lot of specialists, people who they didn't necessarily care, or like maybe they knew about let's go to the moon and stuff like that, right? But their expertise was heat shielding for certain types of devices, compressing oxygen in a certain way so it could be delivered in a different way, designing a special alloy of metal that would be, have a certain tensile behavior, right? So all of these things, of course, were important. You can do the Apollo project without them. So would we say, for example, that somebody working on gene editing technology, which may be a constituent requirement to carry out some interventions to solve aging, do they count? Do they count in the system? And my answer to that right now is no, they don't count. And by the way, this is I would call it a provisional answer, because we're putting together a group of people to establish clear guidelines for how we do this. And it's probably going to be also a moving target as we go. But I'll explain why a tool may not necessarily fall in this category. And I say necessarily because it could actually fall in the category. The reason is that intention matters. So what I would challenge us to do is think about the counterfactual. So let's say that we spent $1 trillion a year and we lumped a bunch of things into them. So you and I sat together and we just said, this cancer research, this seems kind of related. Let's bucket it in. This tool for lab automation, not so related, leave it out. But this other tool for gene editing kind of seems related. Let's put it in. Okay. So let's say we did that slicing and dicing and we ended up with some amount, which we try to optimize, right? Because you always improve what you measure. And so if you're measuring in that mechanism, then people would start pressing in that direction, right? Because they're thinking about that improvement. And then we arrived at an outcome where we spent $1 trillion and then we failed. So after 10 years, there's been no progress. Would we look back at those 10 years and would we say, well, but it was reasonable. We think it was reasonable. We did our best, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, maybe we would, right? But technically, if you try to kind of investigate every single thing there, so this or that cancer research, this or that tool, et cetera, you might question it and say, well, did this really contribute to solving aging? Were we wrong in assessing it? You might question yourself more. You know what I mean? So what I would suggest is that actually the intention matters. If you divorce research from intention, you end up in a place where it's very hard to evaluate whether you were supporting the right thing. So in other words, if that $1 trillion were spent also in a kind of pick and choose way, but there was that added filter, the leader of the initiative had to say, we are doing this with the purpose of solving aging or enabling the solution to aging. Then we would look back and we could be more confident to say, all right, they were all trying their hardest. This person had this idea, they worked on a tool, this other person tried to do research into cancer, but they thought it would be relevant and they made an argument and they communicated to their staff and to the world that we're doing this to solve aging, and that's the goal. I think we would be much more tolerant of the mistakes. Now, I'll just add a small caveat there. Some people will argue that, when you do science, you're dealing with many unknown unknowns. And so you could say, well, this is an example that a friend of mine gave. He said, well, let's say you're in the Middle Ages and you want to develop a CT scanner. Okay. So you're here and that's somewhere here. And there's this complicated web of all the things you need to figure out by the time you can develop the CT scanner. I mean, an incredible number of things, theoretical, engineering, practical, et cetera. And would knowing that the goal is a CT scanner help you at all in discovering the things that would actually enable you to build the scanner? You might argue that those things, knowing that you want to build a CT scanner, wouldn't necessarily help you. But I think that example breaks when you think about other examples, or when you think about how directed curiosity guides our imagination and our search for solutions. So we are creatures that engage with the world. We see, for example, animals fly. And so from the kind of dawn of recorded history, people were contemplating this idea of what if humans could fly too, right? And so, Leonardo da Vinci created a flying contraption, and this famous Jewish rabbi, the Rambam, talked about steel ships flying in the air, you know what I mean? Like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and so on and so forth. And you could say, well, look, like that informed people's motivation and curiosity, and eventually did create more and more innovation in that direction. And so this is just going full circle to answer this question of like, okay, well, if a movement has a distinct goal in mind, how do we measure our progress towards that distinct goal? And how do we make sure that we're doing things that are actually contributing, or at least, are reasonable to do as potentially contributing? And so that's kind of where I see us standing today.
Say I hear an entrepreneur speaking here, because it looks like you have a North Star goal and you are trying to build back, or at least to understand how to connect many pieces of a puzzle with the goal that you are trying to achieve. Although, yeah, that doesn't sound simple, obviously, because there's so many unknowns.
Yeah. And I was trying to address this at the highest level of abstraction, but to put it in very concrete terms, if we get some influence, right, we vitalists, and somebody in a position of, allocating capital is a vitalist, then they might allocate capital to projects that have the goal of solving aging, right, more preferentially. And that means more money would fall into this bucket. So as we're trying to accelerate our goal as a movement, as a community, all of us vitalists, me, you, anybody who agrees with these ideas will be thinking about how they can contribute in whatever context they are to move more resources to people who are intending to solve aging. And I think that becomes this kind of natural funnel where, maybe the coin is rolling around in this funnel, but eventually it gets to a good place.
Yeah, definitely. Probably 100 out of 100 people, if you ask them, they would say that they would like to live longer and stay healthy. But what is this bridge that connects people who naturally want to live longer with this 1% of world GDP spent on solving aging? So how will you create this influence except recruiting new members? So you will need to, I don't know, to go into politics or whatever.
Yeah. Well, movements evolve differently. There are some movements that have a big inflection change in a very short period, like certain political revolutions of the past, or, for example, something like women's right to vote. There was kind of like this escalating pressure, and then a singular moment where the rules shifted, right? You had, a monarchy, and then a singular moment where you moved to the American Revolution, and now you had a representative democracy. But there are other revolutions that I would say are more diffuse. So to some degree, I would say the gay rights movement is like that. Climate change and the environmental movement is somewhat like that, right? There wasn't like this one moment where everybody just became like environmentally aware. There were a million small battles that people were fighting in their own community to deal with pollution, to deal with types of diseases or chemical issues, pesticides, things that had to do with natural ecosystems that were being harmed, etc. The ozone layer initially in the 90s. And so my sense is that this revolution is likely to happen in a more diffuse manner, simply because the gravity of the Sickcare machine is so immense that to think that we could change that just by getting like one elected official, even if that official is the president of France or the president of XYZ country, is rather unlikely. Because it's not just a figurehead or even a person, an important person in a centralized authority. It's an entire system, which is completely based on this, a system that employs tens or hundreds of millions of people in the world, this Sickcare system. You know what I mean? And it's not inherently evil. It's just a product of its circumstances. And so to shift this to something else feels like it requires not insubstantial number of people to coordinate effectively. Now they don't need to be the majority initially. Of course, no movement is the majority initially. And my sense is that there will be political levers that need to be pulled, and that will affect change. So yes, it'll happen on the economic side. So starting companies that are led by founders who believe that solving aging is important. and communicate that and allocate the capital that they control to achieve that goal and move the companies in a way that achieves that goal, that pushes towards that goal. And it'll also be politicians who are either vitalists or open to vitalist ideas or embrace vitalist ideas because they are exposed to them, because some vitalists are doing the work of exposing them to them, right? I mean, it's something that they've been saying a lot in this election cycle in the US, that a lot of the laws, at least in the US, I don't know how it is in Germany or elsewhere, but I suspect in democracies it's often similar, are written by lobbyists. And the reason is that it's not like some sort of evil scheme. It's just that the topics are so complex. A politician gets into office. I think it was recently, and there was an interview with J.D. Vance, the candidate for vice president. And he was saying, look, you come into office, you're allocated 20 staffers. Now you need to figure out how to deal with issues in a country of 340 million people with incredible diversity of complexity of these issues. And there's no way you can do that. 20 staffers, they can't figure this out. So what do they end up doing? They rely on these think tanks, these lobbyists, et cetera, to feed them the information and expert opinion, which goes back to what we were discussing before, that people in general, no matter how powerful they are, have to defer to certain levels of expertise because you just can't do everything in a specialized world. And so I guess the positive upshot of that is that if you are systematic in creating a message, conveying it, and having a coordinated group that's effective about educating politicians, running for different positions, and creating economic value, which is driven by the ideas that you're trying to promote, our bet is that we could see some real acceleration, especially and maybe most importantly, because deep down, everybody wants to be healthier for longer. This is not, something foreign that we're trying to put upon people. What people are not relating to is being sicker for longer. Nobody wants that. And what people are not relating to is the idea that aging is tractable. And that's just because they're constantly fed the message that aging is inevitable.
I think that you forgot one thing. And I believe that what is also important is culture. So cultural changes. Are you writing already a book, or I don't know, maybe creating a film about vitalism or about the fact that aging is not natural or predestined?
Well, yeah, exactly. Natural, that's right. What is natural or unnatural? These are just labels. We're born into this world and we're self-aware and we try to create the best situation for ourselves, right? Ourselves, our communities. And so I think pushing the envelope on that with an open mind is really all we can ask. And certainly using science and technology, which is basically the closest thing we have to magic, is the way to do that. It's the thing that seems to be working. We are in the process of writing a book, and we want to produce a lot more media and cultural assets. So I 100% resonate with that.
Yeah, I'm definitely already looking forward to reading or watching it. So to wrap it up, my last question is, how can people learn more about vitalism and how can they potentially join your movement?
Sure. So you can go to vitalism.io. That's the website for the philosophy. It also includes ways that you could join the foundation, which is a nonprofit meant to promote the ideas of vitalism. And so you can sign up with an email. The email list is managed by the foundation, and that just makes you more connected and a part of the, let's say, coordinated vitalist community. I mean, anybody can be a vitalist. If you agree with this, you're a vitalist, and you're always welcome to whatever and wherever any other vitalists are doing things. If you sign up by email, you'll get updates on the different initiatives and things that are going on. If you want to support the foundation, if you want to be more active, then you can become a mobilized vitalist, which is somebody who pays some membership fee. And that gives you all sorts of benefits in the foundation, the community. Specifically, this model is very important for two reasons. Number one, it allows the nonprofit to be 100% sustainable and independent. And number two, it's a small hurdle. By the way, people, if anybody can't afford it, they can just pay even $1. They can pay whatever they want. We're not trying to gate people by cost, but we do want to filter in a certain group of people who wants to be more active. And so if you join this group, you get access to private Telegram channel. You get access to events that we run, conferences that are application only, which you'll be approved for automatically. You get a lot of discounts. We also have a lot of partnerships with health and longevity services to give benefits, early access to treatments, and other things for our community. But I think most importantly, you get connected with other motivated vitalists. So if you think about the people who care about this, they currently don't know other people like them. They can't differentiate. Somebody says they're into longevity, but what they mean is they do sauna and cold plunge. Another person says they're into longevity and they might just be, studying, I don't know, cellular membranes in a lab, but they actually don't even care about extending lifespans or health spans. You know what I mean? They're just like doing it because they're interested in the research. Nothing wrong with either of these two cases, but those are not people who I would consider vitalists, right? Because their motivation is not to solve aging through science and technology. And so there's a lot of value in finding people like that. And guess what? It costs money and time to go out and find these people. Like, they're not just out there raising their hands and emailing us and saying, hey, here we are. No, we need to go and find them. And that means that we need some capital and some group of people who is motivated to push this forward. And so, that has produced right now a community which already has hundreds of founders, scientists. This is the mobilized community, top scientists and others. And so we all help each other accelerate. And that's really important, because that's a core part of this idea that if you're a vitalist, and especially if you're a mobilized vitalist, then I know you're trying to do something, and I'm going to do everything I can to help accelerate you, to elevate you, to help you connect with people, raise capital, connect with investors, spread your message, figure out what your message is. Maybe we can help each other refine the message. And so I think that's really important. So to summarize, go to vitalism.io. You can follow me on Twitter. It's just my full name, at ADAMGRIES, Adam Gries on Twitter. And if you want to be more involved and you really want this to accelerate, I encourage you to join us in every way.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. It was an amazing conversation, and I'm wishing you a great day. Thank you.